All right, Steelers fans, here we go. We're diving into some running back stats because I have a question. This comes from PM. That stands for Paul. I think it's Marlier. I probably said it wrong. Sorry, Paul. You can email me again and tell me how I butchered it. But that's who sent me a question before that I said I couldn't really answer. This is one that was a little bit more difficult, but I spent some time and really compiled some stuff. And this is what he said. He said, I was wondering why some games Warren or Harris got more yards. Was one better on the road? I know Warren ran like he was possessed in Cleveland. Was one better on grass or turf? I know some analysts pointed out that it was scheme-based for success of one over the other. I don't want to get people started on who should be the starter. I'm just wondering if Smith's scheme will fit one over the other. And if I get them in fantasy football next year, then when is the best game to start them? Thanks, Paul Marlier. Something like that. Sorry, Paul. Nerd of Steel is how he signed it. Now, I'll tell you this. I'm not getting into which one's better for Arthur Smith's scheme. I'm not as much into looking at that kind of thing with statistics because I'm looking at the stats. I am looking at the numbers. So let's dive into this number. These numbers. My goodness, I created a spreadsheet to break all this down. And let me see. It's got 12 tabs on it just to compile all the data. But this is what I did. I brought the totals for Jaylen Warren, Najee Harris. Now, I should say this. No other running back got a carry last year. I brought this up on the Scobro show because we talked about running backs this week. And no other running back had a carry this year. I mean, you could argue if Connor Hayward is a fullback. I'm not counting that. So this is, it was the Najee Harris, Jaylen Warren show. So I went ahead and looked at the totals. I went ahead and included the playoff game as well. And I looked at rushing attempts, rushing yards per attempt. I went ahead and looked at the receiving just to keep the data there. I had target receptions and yards. I did that for both players. I didn't get into touchdowns because that really could be situational. So I really wanted to focus more on the yards based on the data that I was asked to break down. So let me first give you the totals. Here's the totals. Jaylen Warren rushed, with playoffs included, 157 times for 822 yards, which was a 5.24 average. He was targeted 76 times for 63 yards with 386 receiving yards. Najee Harris had 267 rushing attempts, so exactly 110 more. He had 1,072 rushing yards, which gave a 4.01 yards per attempt. He was targeted 41 times with 31 receptions for 185 receiving yards. I will tell you this, neither player had a receiving touchdown this year. I also went and broke it down. I averaged it per game. So for the whole season, Jaylen Warren had 8.72 rushing attempts per game, 45.67 rushing yards per game, 4.22 targets per game. For who cares about targets? I shouldn't even do that one. He had 3.5 receptions per game for 21.44 receiving yards per game. With Najee Harris, he had 14.83 rushing attempts per game. So that is just over 6 more per game than Warren. He had 59.56 rushing yards per game. That's almost 14 yards more, not quite. And he had forget targets, 1.72 receptions per game for 10.28 receiving yards per game. So that's the breakdown per game. Now, let's look at some of the data. Now, first, let's look at grass versus turf. Now, to let you know, I couldn't sort this data this way. That's why I had to compile it myself in my own spreadsheet and then mark which games were which. Now, I did use Pro Football Reference where all these numbers came from, and some of these I had to total up myself then, calculate them on the spreadsheet. But I used Pro Football Reference to figure out which games were grass and which ones were turf. Now, maybe it's a hybrid or something. I don't know how they break it down. All I could do was go by what they said. So these are the teams that had grass. The Pittsburgh Steelers. So that right there is 9 games. Pittsburgh Steelers were grass, Las Vegas Raiders, Cleveland Browns, Baltimore Ravens. That's it. When you're looking at turf, obviously these are all road games. According to Pro Football Reference, it was Houston, Los Angeles Rams, Cincinnati, Indy, Seattle, and Buffalo. So those were the turf games versus the grass games. So how did that ultimately turn out? Okay, well, let's look at it. So grass versus turf. Jaylen Warren on grass, I could give you the total numbers, but instead I'm going to give you the averages per game. He averaged 8.25 rushing attempts per game, 46.58 yards per game on grass. That's an average of 5.65 yards per carry. His receptions were 3.5 receptions for 23.42 yards on grass. On turf, he averaged 9.67 rushing attempts, so that's over one attempt more in those games per game. 43.83 yards per game. That's less. That's not quite 3 yards less. So for a 4.53 rushing yards per attempt on turf. And then his receptions was also 3.5 per game, but for 17.5 yards. So when you look at it, let's look at the receiving yards per game. He had almost 6 more yards per game on the same amount of receptions. And he had more than a yard per attempt. This is all on grass versus turf. So now, this isn't taking into account the quality of opponent. We'll talk about that. This was just grass versus turf. So if you look at Najee Harris, he had 14.42 rushes per game on grass versus 15.67 on turf. So he had more attempts, just like Jaylen Warren. He averaged 54.75 on grass and 69.17 on turf. So that meant Najee Harris had 3.8 yards per attempt on grass and 4.41 yards per attempt on turf. So right there, the numbers tell you. Now, even though Warren technically had more yards per attempt on turf than Harris, Harris did better of the two things. Only looking at himself, he did better on turf. Warren did better on grass. When it came to the to receiving, though, Harris he averaged 2.08 receptions per game on grass, 1 reception per game on turf, and almost the exact same yards per game, 10.25 on grass, 10.33 on turf. So he had just as many yards on less than half the attempts on turf. So I would say if you had to break it down, Najee Harris had better numbers on turf. Jaylen Warren had better numbers on grass. There you go when it comes to that. Now let's look at home games versus away games. That I don't have to tell you which ones are which, like I had to with the turf. So let's just look at home games versus away games. And they had an even number of both. I'll tell you that. Even number of both because I counted the playoff game. So 18 games. At home, Jaylen Warren had per game 8.11 rushing attempts for 40.89 yards. That was 5.04 yards per attempt. Receptions were 3.44 a game for 25 yards. On the road, he had 9.33 attempts per game, 50.44 yards per game with 5.4 yards. That's 5.4 versus 5.04 for Warren on the road versus home. He also had 3.56 receptions per game, about the same as it was at home, but only 17.89 receiving yards compared to 25. So he rushed better per attempt on the road, but he did better receiving yards wise at home, if you wanted to look at that from last year. Najee Harris. At home, he had 12.89 rushing attempts per game. Where on the road, he was 16.78. So almost 4 more attempts on the road. We'll talk about why that is the case a little bit later. His rushing yards per game at home was 49.44. Where on the road, it was 69.67. His average at home was 3.84 yards, where on the road, it was 4.15. So he also did better on the road. Now, when it came to receiving, he had 2.11 receptions per game at home for 11.22 yards per game. And on the road, it was 1.33 receptions for 9.33. Not really much of a difference there when you look at how much, of volume. Maybe slightly better on the road. But both of these guys rushed better on the road. So why would that be? Maybe, what would that have to do with it? Maybe it had to do more about their opponents than it did being home or away or even grass or turf. I'm just giving you the data right now. That's the data. Grass, turf, home, away for those two players. So let's finish it off, polish it off by looking at how they did against good rushing defenses. All right. And I'll be honest with you, this is probably there's more discrepancy here. Now, I'm not saying the data makes sense because sometimes you go through the data and you're like, can you really draw much of a conclusion with it? Sometimes the answer of there's not much difference is the right answer. That's where the data leads you. You've got to let the data lead you to where it goes, not try to make it fit to what you think it might be. That's not what I'm doing here. So this is what I did. I looked at final results of the regular season. I did the playoff. I included the Steelers playoff game here, but I looked at the rushing defense rank for every team. Rushing defense rank. And then I broke those games into different categories. All right. The first category was ranked 10th or better. And they didn't play someone who played a team that was ranked 10th. So it was single digit ranking for rushing defense. The Steelers played 4 teams that finished in the top 9, I'll say, in rushing defense. I think you'd be surprised who the 4 teams are. Because I'll tell you, it's not just 4 teams, it's 4 games. Because none of the AFC North teams were in the top 10 in rushing defense. All right, the teams that the Steelers faced in the top 10 was San Francisco was 3rd. The New England Patriots were 4th. The Houston Texans were 6th. And the Jacksonville Jaguars were 9th. Those are the 4 games of what's going on there. And when you look at it, out of those 4 games, Jaylen Warren, 5.75 rushing attempts per game in each of those, looking at each of those games. 16.25 rushing yards per game in those games. That's low. 2.83 rushing or yards per attempt. Now, when it came to receiving, he had 4.75 receptions per game for 21.5 receiving yards. Remember that. Najee Harris, he averaged 9.75 rushing attempts per game for 36 rushing yards per game, which was a 3.69 yards per attempt. Now, 3.69 doesn't sound good, but that's still better than Warren's 2.83. These guys did not run well against the top rushing defenses. And they also didn't run much. But then Najee Harris had 2.75 receptions per game for 23.75 yards. I think you're going to find a trend when I bring that up when we go to the next one and thereon. Then I looked at teams that were from 11 to 20. And I'll be honest with you, the Steelers didn't have anyone 16 to 20. There was 11. They were 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Yeah, there were 7 games, but some of them were duplicates because the 11th best rushing defense was Cleveland. 12th was the Rams. 13th was Tennessee. 14th was Baltimore. And 15th was Buffalo. So those are the teams. Jaylen Warren, 8.29 rushing attempts per game. So that's already 8.29 up from 5.75. Rushing yards per game, 54.29. That's up from 16.25. And the rushing yards per attempt, 6.55, up from 2.83. So Jaylen Warren, not very good against the top defenders, much better against that middle group. So even if they were a pretty good rushing defense, Jaylen Warren can still go out there and do some pretty good stuff. I mean, he had 100. His biggest game was at Cleveland with 129 yards. Well, he had that one huge run, which really helped, of course. But now his receptions, he averaged 3 receptions per game for 25.43 yards. That was up for him. As the yards was up because it was 21.5 before. Najee Harris, he averaged 14.86 rushing attempts per game, 55.14 yards per game, 3.71 yards per attempt. That's very close to the 3.69 he had against the top defenses. He didn't have that much of a difference between the top 10 and the next 10. Now, when it came to receptions, he was at 2.14 per game versus 2.75. And the yards were all the way down to 8.86 yards per game, which it was 23.75 if you recall. So Najee Harris did much better getting the ball as a receiver against the very top rushing defenses. Didn't bother to throw him the ball for a lot of yards against the middle of the road ones. But Jaylen Warren, he saw a bump in his rushing yards when you looked at that middle group. Then you got 7 games from the bottom. Okay. This was from 21 on. So the Raiders were 21. Let's see here. The Colts were 24th. The Bengals were 26th. The Packers were 28th. Then Seattle was 31st and Arizona was 32nd. So those 2 teams are at the very bottom of the NFL. I'll tell you part of the reason why. They're both in the NFC West, so they both had to go against Christian McCaffrey twice was part of the reason they're so low. When you think about that, that's also why part of the AFC North isn't as high because they have to go against other good rushing teams in the North more often than other teams. But if you look at the numbers from those 7 games at the bottom, Jaylen Warren was given the ball more against these teams. 10.86 attempts, around the same yards, 53.86 as he did against the middle 10. Not as many yards per carry, but it was 4.96, which is still pretty decent. He had 3.29 receptions per game and 17.43 receiving yards per game. Najee Harris saw his carries all the way up to 17.71 per game against these opponents, averaged 77.43 yards per game with 4.37 yards per carry in those contests. So, and then his receptions, he only averaged 0.71 receptions for 4 yards per game. That was his receiving. They didn't bother using Najee Harris as a receiver against the lower rushing defenses. They just didn't do it. They gave him the ball. So if you look at the progression of Najee Harris, he went from 3.69 for the top 10, 3.71 for the next 10, 4.37 for the bottom one. So he got a little bit better and then much better as you went down in competition. Jaylen Warren, bad against the top competition, 2.83 yards per attempt, 6.55 for the next 10, and 4.96 for the last 10. He saw a big jump when the level of competition went down. So I'll be honest with you. I mean, Najee Harris just still had more volume in general than Jaylen Warren. It's just how it worked. But they obviously did better against the weaker defenses. That's really so. If you're looking next year for your fantasy, just look at how that team is ranked defensively. Now, I know that didn't help you week 1 against San Francisco. You didn't know they're going to be the number 3 defense, and that Jaylen Warren was going to have 3 rushes for 6 yards, and Najee Harris was going to have 6 rushes for 31 yards. I mean, my goodness. Okay. Some of the games that really stood out, that one did. But I mean, Najee Harris had a decent average in that game. But I mean, New England is the worst. Warren had 1.57 yards per attempt, where Harris had 2.42 yards per attempt. But that was against the number 4 rushing defense in the league. They were not good rushing the ball that game. But then again, Mitch Trubisky wasn't really a concern throwing the ball either. Najee Harris did not do well against Jacksonville. Jaylen Warren did, 3.8, not great either, but not as bad as Najee's 1.86 per carry. So when you look at those numbers, they just, the most carries against a top 10 rushing defense was Najee Harris had 14 against Houston, 14 for 71 yards, over 5 yards per carry. That's the most rushing yards they had against the top defenses. They just didn't rush it as much. The next 10, Najee Harris had double-digit rushing attempts in every game, with the top being 26 against Baltimore in Week 18. Okay, that was the only one over 20. The next closest was 16 against Tennessee. Jaylen Warren, he didn't see that much more rushing attempts. He had double digits against Tennessee, but he had 3 games with 9, which was more than what he had with the previous group. So they ran the ball more. Then you get to the last 7. Once again, Najee Harris, all double digits. 27 against Seattle was the top. I mean, Jaylen Warren, he had double digits in 4 of the 7. So what did the Steelers wisely do? Ran the ball more against defenses that weren't as good against the run. There you go. And when you talk about discrepancy of who ran better, there was less variation with Najee Harris than there was with Jaylen Warren. But I mean, Jaylen Warren had a better yards per attempt in the bottom 2 tiers, but he had a much better range of data there. I mean, much worse. It was more spread out. There we go. That's what I'm trying to get to. So that's the numbers behind the rushing yards. Sorry, I went over a little bit. That was mainly because of my little rant about the numbers with award ceremony, and it still kind of drives me nuts. But hey, I really want to thank Paul for giving me a question. I need more questions. STLR Superfan Dad, that's my X or Twixter or Twitter, whatever it is. If you add @gmail.com, that's STLR Superfan Dad @gmail.com. That's my email address to send me questions. I want to know what numbers you all want to know so I can do stuff like I just did there with the running backs. Hey, make sure you're checking out all of our podcasts. I'll be back tonight with Brian Anthony Davis and Jeff Hartman for the Steelers preview. We'll continue to bring you the same lineup throughout the offseason with a couple things here or there that occasionally might be off based on people's schedules. And of course, make sure you're checking out steelcurtainetwork.com. We're really putting the data out there, putting the information out there. I was kind of frustrated because I noticed some comments after the Scobro show Tuesday night. At the end, they're like, "Oh, there's about this many days until the draft." I'm like, I literally just wrote that article for the website. Literally just wrote it that day, counting down the exact number of days to various offseason events, all the way to next Super Bowl. And I'm like, and these are our own people in our live chat. I'm like, are you not going to the website? Please, if you like the podcast, go check out the website because it's really going to help us out if you can do that. All right, I'll stop with that now. I'll be back next Thursday with some more numbers, especially if you all give me some good questions. And as I always say to close these out, thanks for geeking out with me.